Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our 4th annual National LGBT Leadership Forum. My name is Tony Timoreos, and I have the pleasure of serving as the CEO President of our fund. What originally was intended to be a one-night show, it has grown to this size over the past 4 years, and I'm delighted to have you all here tonight. A lot of you have asked, why do you guys do this? Why are you doing this? Well, as you know, our fund is a community foundation, is an LGBT community foundation, and one of our primary functions is really to connect the community to causes that matter. And I feel that full equality is clearly one of the causes that matters most to us right now. And these forums are a vehicle that provides us with the opportunity to get our community educated and engaged about the issues that are really important to all of us. And as Martin Luther King once says, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. So before you demand to get this discussion started, I just want to recognize a couple of people, some of our sponsors for this evening. And first of all, a huge thank you to the Gay and Lesbian Lawyers Network who have underwritten this entire evening tonight. And I think, thank you. Leah and the board of the GLN are here in the audience. If you could just take a moment to stand up and say hello, we can acknowledge you. Some additional support was provided by Adams Furniture for providing the stage settings this evening to make our panelists and our moderator as comfortable as possible. You can buy the furniture if you'd like. No, you can't take it with you, all right? You can, Barefoot Wines for the refreshments that you're going to be having after the forum, so we can get you liquored up and get you to donate to our fund afterwards. Downtown Love Studios and Bruce Presley for the sound and movie version of tonight's video. So if you see the camera, wave very nicely. Thank you. And we can't forget all our volunteers and our business sponsors for their incredible support, not only tonight, but all year round, and I really appreciate all your efforts. And one more important group that really needs to be recognized today, and we really can't forget them, is our veterans. So if you are a veteran or you're currently serving in our armed forces, please stand up to be recognized. Okay, let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator for this evening. Many of you know her well and also know that her bio in tonight's program is a very small fraction of her accomplishments. Many of you also know that her heart is bigger than the size of this auditorium. About 10 years ago, I met this very special, very tall, and very attractive woman. And at the time we met, she was living in Oklahoma and we were living in Connecticut. So we maintained a long-distance friendship that lasted for several years until Arthur and I moved down here to Florida about 11 years ago, and she decided to come down for a visit. And the rest is history. Now, Mona calls South Florida her home, and we are grateful for her tremendous generosity here in our community. And I'm not only honored to have her as our moderator tonight, but also as a board member at our fund and a close friend. Please welcome our moderator, Miss Mona Pittenger.
Well, good evening and welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to see so many women here this evening and to see such a large crowd. This is really great. As you know, our topic this evening is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness after the midterm elections. And I'm sorry to have to say that there were more low points than there were high points last week. I think something that was particularly sad was the loss of Joe Saunders' seat by only 710 votes. We also lost the Democratic control of the Senate. And we still have Rick Scott as our governor. There was one high point, though. We have the first openly gay Attorney General in the United States, and that's Maura Healey, who's a Democrat out of Massachusetts. So that was some great news. Now, before the introductions, I would like to just have a little bit of a summary about what's really happened in the last 2 years, because 2 years ago when we had this panel, we had 6 states with marriage equality. Last year, after the passage of DOMA in June, we had 15 states with marriage equality by the time of the forum, and now we're up to 32 states plus the District of Columbia who have marriage equality. We also have 3 additional states, Kansas, Montana, and South Carolina, which have set binding precedents. So we are well on our way, and we'll have some interesting conversations later this evening about that. But just a point that I think is noteworthy is for the first time in the marriage equality movement, it's easier to actually name the states that don't have marriage than it is to name the states that do. So let's have a hand. So we have 5 panelists tonight. This is the first time we've been blessed to have an ally here, and I wanted to go ahead and introduce everybody. Paul Smith, to my immediate left, is a returning panelist. Paul is a partner with Jenner and Block in their Washington, D.C. office and has had a Supreme Court practice of about 30 years, which is surprising because he doesn't look nearly that old. Now, it may have been the Lawrence case that actually aged Paul, because this was really the case in 2003 that Paul spoke before the Supreme Court and actually won this case on our behalf. And I believe that that was really the case that has paved the way for all of the progress that we've had in this movement. It was so amazing. Paul, you are one of my personal heroes. Truly you are. Please give a warm welcome to Paul Smith. To my far left is Stacy Long Simmons, who is the Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs for the National LGBTQ Task Force in Washington, D.C. Stacy is pinch hitting tonight for Ray Carey, who's their ED, who unfortunately had to have back surgery a few days ago, but is recovering nicely. Stacy was, prior to her position as the Director of Public Policy at the task force, she was actually their chief lobbyist. She is an attorney who is originally from Queens, New York, and she was formerly the Deputy Director for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., which serves low-income residents. Thank you for giving Stacy a warm welcome. I was going to actually mention a couple other things that are fabulous about her, but you know, those index cards stuck together. So I do want to just point out that Stacy has been active in a lot of civic groups, and I mainly wanted to point out that she was the past chair of the D.C. Commission for Women in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Stacy. And on my immediate right is Kevin Cathcart, who I'm also a very big fan of. I've known Kevin for about 10 years when I was fortunate enough to be on the Lambda Legal Board. Kevin is also a returning panelist and is the executive director for Lambda Legal and has been since 1992. When I had the opportunity to be on the board, I developed a tremendous amount of respect for Kevin, for his strategic thinking, his really great understanding of the law, and his ability to lead the organization. And under your leadership of Lambda, it has really just become this amazing powerhouse. Lambda's biggest focus is far-reaching litigation and also public education for LGBT people and also people living with HIV and AIDS. Please give a warm welcome to Kevin Cathcart. To Kevin's immediate right is Nadine Smith, who is also a returning panelist and I believe is known to everybody in this room as the co-founder and the CEO of Equality Florida since 1997. Nadine has spent the bulk of her career working in social justice, particularly in the LGBTQ space, and was one of 4 co-chairs for the 1993 March on Washington. She was honored in 2013 as one of this state's most powerful and influential women. And certainly, Nadine, you have changed the face of Florida. A warm welcome, please, for Nadine Smith. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. We are so delighted that she is here tonight. Thank you. You have certainly been our most passionate political ally, and for that we are all completely grateful. For more than 20 years, you have dedicated your life to working for the people of South Florida, and I would like to point out that that is working for all of the people of South Florida. Thank you. She has served in the Florida House and Senate from 1992 to 2004, and in 2004 won a seat into the U.S. Congress. She served as the LGBT caucus chair in Congress and also has consistently worked to expand rights for our community. She chairs the Democratic National Committee. Please give a big gay welcome to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. There's a lot to talk about nationally, but I'd really like to begin with Nadine by talking a little bit about what has happened in the state of Florida. So please tell us what impact you think Governor Scott's reelection is going to have on LGBT Floridians and also on the work of Equality Florida.
All right, so strap in, everybody. Well, actually, I will say this. The day after the election, as we sat at our computers thinking about how to talk about it, you know, those of us on the Equality Florida staff, you know, what we came to was this. We didn't want to sugarcoat it because obviously we took some losses. We lost some real heroes. But the truth is we were born in adversity. I mean, we are all-terrain activists. We have won in places that people thought were too hostile for us to even begin. We, you know, when Equality Florida came on the scene, Jeb Bush had just become governor. The legislature had taken a hard turn to the right. And even in that environment, we blocked all of the anti-LGBT legislation. So what we really wanted to convey was we're still moving forward. And in fact, for us, in many ways, nothing's changed from the day before because we're still dealing with basically the same political environment that we were winning in prior to the election. So I will say this. In last session, when we did the whip count on the most important piece of legislation we're working on, the statewide non-discrimination bill called the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, we had the votes between the Republican and Democratic co-sponsors and the Republican and Democrats who have pledged to vote for it to move that bill in the House, which is the more conservative of the two chambers. And I believe that vote count still holds up today. So for us, you know, we'd hoped that there would be a shortcut. We hoped that the incline would be a little less steep, but we're still moving forward. And I think that, you know, when we began, I think last year we said, we're going to have marriage equality in Florida by 2016, and we're going to have a statewide non-discrimination law by 2016, and nothing's changed in terms of that timeline and the work ahead.
Thanks. I do have a follow-on question, Nadine,
Sure.
which I know you all worked tirelessly this year to increase voter turnout, and I want to know what your perspective is on that. Why did we not get more good fortune with that very last final push that you all made in the last several weeks? And what can we do? What can we do differently in the next election cycle?
Well, you know, people often ask about, you know, what's the post-marriage moment? You know, where will we pivot to? And I would say this: we've got to bulk up our ability to mobilize in election time. So here's what I'd say. We did more this election than any other election. Many of you probably got mailers. They were probably the only LGBT mailers you received talking about where candidates stood. We've been pushing the party and allies to focus more resources on mobilizing our community. But I will tell you this, with a database of over 200,000 voters, when we went into Election Day, our turnout was 20 points higher than the general turnout of the Florida population. So we don't know what the final numbers are. We won't have those for a month or so when they finish tallying it all. But we turn out when we are able to deliver a message that tells people what's at stake for our community turns out. And when we don't have the resources to tell our community what's at stake, like too many Floridians, our people stay home. So really it comes down to resources. But our community will turn out when there's a bright line distinction between candidates and we're able to show that to them. And to me, one of the biggest things that we have to do is continue to scale up, because there's a universe much bigger than the 200,000 in our database that we could have been communicating with, we could have been mobilizing if we had the resources to do it. So a big focus, even in these last couple of days, has been to talk to a lot of the allies who cheer us on but don't necessarily bring resources to the table.
Well, and as just a brief question on that, did the Proposition 2 medical marijuana amendment actually hurt us or help us?
I don't know yet. I mean, the talking point is that 58% of the voters voted for medical marijuana. More people support marijuana than support the governor, which is true. It's factual. So I don't know. I think that those of us, part of this forum is to speak very frankly, and so I want to do that. There were losses we shouldn't have sustained. There were things that we have to do better as people who care about equality. But I also think that we've built a strategy. We are not a partisan organization. We are a bipartisan organization, and our strategy for winning has had to be bipartisan, whether it's in a city council or a county commission up in the Panhandle, or whether it's in the legislature. So our strategy can't be driven by one party. But the reality is, more often than not, the Democrats have been the party that has stood on these issues, but they have to do more than stand on the issues. They actually have to invest in mobilizing our community, just like mobilizing women, just like mobilizing Black and Hispanic voters, just like mobilizing young people. And those are some of the conversations we're having now.
Thanks, Nadine. Congresswoman, this U.S. Congress has been identified as the most ineffective Congress in decades. What can we say?
Yeah.
In order for Florida to grow and stay competitive, how will Florida catch up to the changing attitudes that are around the country right now as it relates to LGBT Americans? And what do you think can be accomplished in the next congressional term?
Well, that's a good question. Taking your questions backwards, as far as what can be accomplished in the next congressional term, that is really going to be dependent upon whether or not the new Republican leadership in the Senate and the leadership in the House decide that they heard what we think the voters said on Tuesday last week, and that is that I know I heard all across our community here and all across the country when I traveled as the chair of the DNC, that they really just want us to work together. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a message that I heard repeatedly. People are tired of the gridlock. They're just tired of it. And they end up tuning out what it is a candidate is saying when it's just more disagreement and vitriol. I have not really seen in the last week a lot of promise come out of the rhetoric from my friends on the other side of the aisle, that they're all that interested in common ground. I think the ball is going to be, and yes, I'm saying this through my lens as a Democrat, like Nadine is saying, through a nonpartisan lens. But I mean, we have a presidential election coming up, one in which they have not had success in modern times. In recent times, we're having trouble having success in midterm elections. We will be able to work together if Republicans have not concluded that they won this election because Americans have embraced their agenda.
Well, and speaking of Republicans, how do you think, if at all, will you be able to use your influence and work with the state legislature?
Well, this is my 22nd year in office. I'm moving into my 23rd, and I've spent most of those years in the minority. So in spite of being the head of my national party, common ground is something, in order for me to be effective as an individual legislator, that I've had to recognize and reach across the aisle, develop individual relationships, and that's going to be critical, really, Mona. The question is will this new class that has come in from both sides recognize that if we reach across the aisle, if you build relationships across the aisle, and if we decide that there are a few key things that we need to work together on, then we can make progress. I wish I could say I were more hopeful at the national level on the issues important to the LGBT community, because the things that we have pending are things that the other side of the aisle really simply doesn't. I mean, we have 8 Republican co-sponsors of ENDA, and I'm not even sure if all of them are still in Congress, but given this last election. So I wish I could tell you I was more hopeful for progress in this environment.
Okay, thank you. Stacey, I would like to bring you into the conversation, and I know that the task force has engaged in a lot of work to turn out the vote. What was different about this particular election cycle, and how do those results inform the work of the task force over the next couple of years?
Sure. I think one of the things that was different was this was a post-Shelby decision election. And so one of the things that happened when the court basically gutted the Voting Rights Act was it took some of the oversight that the Department of Justice exercised over areas of the country where historically it has been well known that it's been difficult to reach the polls and actually exercise your right to vote if you happen to be an older person, if you happen to be a person of color, if you happen to be someone who has an irregular working schedule. Because a lot of the changes that we saw happening across the nation with respect to different states was changing the polling locations and not notifying the voters until they showed up, or changing the requirements. Of particular concern at the task force is the fact that many states were looking to require identification. And that's an extremely difficult issue and at times insurmountable for members of our community who are transgender or gender nonconforming, because they show up at the poll with their ID and their ID may not match, the name may not match, or the gender marker may not match the representation that they're presenting with. And so even in instances when someone shows up at the polls with all of the correct, everything is sort of checked, T's crossed and I's dotted, there's still a poll worker there who might, through their lens, look at the situation and make a determination that's irregular. And so then we have lost an opportunity for that individual to cast their vote, no matter which way they were going to cast their vote. It's just still disenfranchisement. So we were deeply concerned about some of those issues, along with some of the things that my colleagues over on the other sofa have already referenced.
So what can help change that for the next election cycle?
Well, we're advocating very strongly to have the Voting Rights Act restored. Doubt that the Voting Rights Act legislation that is in place, which actually would not fix the ID issue, but would actually restore some of the oversight issues that I mentioned with respect to the Justice Department having to check in if the states change any of their laws. I doubt that is going to be on the short checklist of issues that is going to be fixed in the lame duck, and I'm not going to sort of, make a forecast about what will happen in the 114th, but we certainly want to see that piece of legislation happen, along with a lot of the work that we need to do to continue to make it abundantly clear to our grassroots members the importance of actually exercising their right to vote, and the buddy system that we need to put into place. So just like you make a coffee date, or you make a happy hour date, or you make a whatever date, hookup date, whatever date you're making, make a voting date. I hope that doesn't get tweeted.
Yeah. I hope it does get tweeted.
Thanks, Stacey. I'd like to shift gears to the marriage picture, but I'm going to ask if everybody will please check their cell phones and ensure that they're on silent or vibrate. I know that this is the matter that is probably certainly near and dear to so many people's hearts, and I've watched a number of my friends get married recently, and it's just been joyous to see how that has really deepened and changed their relationship. Paul, I really would like to start with you, because during the last forum, you made the comment that we should not try to get to the Supreme Court too quickly, that there were some downside risks associated with that. And then in May of this last year, you were quoted extensively in an article that said, a complete victory for marriage equality could be only a year away. Now, with the decision by the Supreme Court, not the decision, the statement by the Supreme Court on October 6th, and the events of last week with the Sixth Circuit, would you update us as far as how you have been surprised, if at all, by what these turn of events have been?
I was quite surprised. I was confidently telling reporters the day before the decision of the Supreme Court to deny review in all of those cases back at the end of first Monday in October, that could never happen, that would be insane, the court would never do it. And so, you know how much of a court pundit I've become. Clearly, though, the conservative justices decided they didn't want to take the case because they didn't think they had the votes, and the more progressive justices, or at least some of them, said, everything's going fine, the good guys are winning, why do we want to rush matters back to the Supreme Court and nationalize this? Let's let things go on for a little while. What's changed now is that for the first time we have a circuit court, a court of appeals up in Cincinnati that's ruled the other way. And that creates a direct conflict between the circuits. And so I think the odds are very, very strong now that the case will get back to the Supreme Court. It'll be granted sometime this term, sometime before the end of June. Whether it'll get there soon enough to be decided this term depends a little on how quickly the lawyers get it back up there and then how quickly the court takes it. Because what happens is if they take a case anytime after about the middle of January, it gets bumped over to the following term. And so we won't have an answer until more like at least a year from now, maybe 15 months from now. So the court could still buy itself a little time by delaying that, or it may just work out that way. But I do think it has to go to the court now. And I continue to think that we have in this court, the 9 people that are there now, we probably have 5 votes, because it's hard to see how they would have denied review in all those cases and let all those thousands of marriages happen if they really thought that there was some significant chance that there were 5 people to say that none of that should be happening, that that's all wrong. So it's sort of.
Well, I'm looking for a prediction.
I mean, I came pretty close.
You are our guru, right? You are the leading LGBT rights litigator in the country. There's just no doubt about that. No, come on. So when do you think we'll actually have a complete victory for marriage equality?
If I had to guess, I would guess that it will miss this term, and it will be decided, it will be argued in October next year and decided somewhere around the winter, next winter, January, February, March. But that's just speculation, It could happen faster, could happen a little slower. It's hard to see the court ducking it any longer than that now that there's this conflict, and you have 4 states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan, where people simply can't exercise the same constitutional right to marry that we have in most of the rest of the country. And that may be added to by the Fifth Circuit, another conservative circuit that's hearing a case. It does seem that the case has to be taken now, and hopefully we've all got the noses counted correctly.
Right.
It would be quite another shock to find out a year from now, after thousands and thousands of more of these marriages have happened, that suddenly the court says, "Oh, never mind. There really isn't a constitutional right here." So that's as close as I can come.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. Kevin, I hate to keep going. Well, actually, I don't hate to keep going back to what people said in past forums, because I think
What
it's
did I
very
say?
effective.
I don't remember.
You should have told us to check.
You actually stated that you thought that the pace of marriage equalities was going to have to switch quite a bit because of so many states, such as my home state of Oklahoma, that had constitutional amendments against it. And you said that everything was going to begin happening in the courts, and clearly your prediction was correct. So what I am really curious about knowing is, we had talked a little bit about the Fifth Circuit, and Paul just mentioned it. I mean, that Texas case is a big looming case, and Texas is a big state. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that, and also then share your opinions of what the court's actions have meant to you and how that might inform Lambda's future work. And then we have that judge down in Puerto Rico. Do you want to kind of share a little bit about that as well, and if that's even really relevant?
I think a lot of this, the judge in Puerto Rico and even the Fifth Circuit are less important now that the Sixth Circuit has ruled. than we thought they might be just a week or two ago. Because a week ago, we still thought there was an excellent chance, and there was a chance, it turned out not so excellent, that the Sixth Circuit would do the right thing, and that it would be the Fifth probably that would create the conflict and enable us to get up to the Supreme Court. So now, I won't say it's unimportant what the Fifth Circuit does, because obviously it means a great deal to people who live in those states, but in terms of the national picture, the stage is now set, and there is a case that's ready for the Supreme Court. And if it turns out there are, another circuit comes out the wrong way, and there could be more than one before it's over, or they could just slow down and wait, because I think there's going to be a cert petition very quickly from the Sixth, and once the Supreme Court says what they're doing, it takes pressure off of the other courts, because they can sort of say, okay, it's going to be decided. So the same thing, I think the decision from the judge in Puerto Rico is really an outlier. I don't think the Baker decision, I don't want to get too lawyerly here, I leave that to Paul as a general rule, but I don't think the Baker decision from 24 years ago is good law. I think if the Supreme Court thought that the Baker decision really was good law, they would have reversed all of the petitions that were before them from the 9th and the 4th and the 10th. So they didn't act like it's good law, and I think that it was convenient that that judge ruled the way that he wanted to rule, and he found something to hang it on. But his opinion would have made sense if he had issued it before the Supreme Court denied cert in all of those cases, and he didn't really deal with the fact that they had denied cert and that they knew that this was out there. They didn't use it. So I'm not so concerned about that one. I think the big issue now is going to be the focus on the Supreme Court and the briefs that have to be done. And, I guess I don't want to jump too far ahead. First, they have to say they're taking it, but I feel completely confident that they're going to take it. That's got to be the focus. And meanwhile, I guess the one thing that I would say to people, particularly if you're concerned or depressed or whatever you might be about the election, is remember, okay, the election happened, November has happened, it hasn't been that good so far, but October was amazing. And that's not that long ago, and we shouldn't give up on it that quickly, because we never thought we would be going into this election. I mean, in September, we didn't think that we'd be sitting here in November with at least 13 additional states, plus who knows what's going on with Missouri and Kansas, and South Carolina is going to have to come on board, and a couple of more. So, we're going to be talking 35 or so in another couple of days, regardless of any other circuit courts. And to add 13 states, including Oklahoma.
I know.
Including Oklahoma, right? So, and yes, I didn't used to predict that Oklahoma would be next.
Nobody did.
I admit I was wrong. Sue me. But we added 13 states, many of which were unlikely in both the popular mind and the legal mind.
Utah, Virginia, Oklahoma.
For example, West Virginia,
Right.
North Carolina, a whole range all across the country. And so we are in so much stronger a position right now because we never had a month. As a community, we never had a month like the month of October, where we made so much progress in so many states in so far-flung a geography.
I just thought, in response to what Kevin said, the strength of our position is partly because of the lack of a backlash in all of these unlikely states. I mean, we were so worried that places like Utah and Oklahoma, once people started getting married, that you'd see all this civil disobedience and people in the streets. And that was what the Supreme Court was worried about. That's why they have gone slow, if there's any rational explanation for why they denied review in those cases. And so I think this will send a message to them as well, that the American people have caught up or are ready for this. There's just no huge deal out of there. That really is the great message of October, I think.
Well, and that's a great point, because I'm from Tulsa, and the Tulsa World, the day after marriage was legal in Oklahoma, had a picture of a lesbian couple who had gotten married, and the title was, "It's Legal." There was no judgment, no criticism, just "It's legal." So that, I think, really goes to your point.
I hate to be a wet blanket, but
Every party needs one. Go ahead.
one of the things that I know is the National Organization for Marriage is planning a major march in 2015, March for Marriage. in which, of course, marriage is going to be between one man and one woman.
Right.
But we need to be ready for that sort of resurgence and show of strength, if that does happen. But they're not just sitting quietly like,
No, we
God,
know
no.
that, we know that. And back to the surprise of some of these states like my home state, Oklahoma, kind of brings me to the point of, really, Florida? Did I really think that it was going to be okay to get married in Oklahoma before it would be legal in Florida? This caught everybody off guard. So absent a Supreme Court ruling, and whatever is going to happen, bring us up to speed on what's happening in Florida and what the expectation is.
So as most people know, there have been, I think, 5 cases really that have moved forward in Florida. Our side has won all of them, including the federal case. The stay that was put in place after Judge Hinkle's decision that said the ban statewide was illegal, unconstitutional, is going to be lifted. He's going to lift it on the 5th. So by the 6th, January. Yeah, thank you. By the 6th, we could go get married unless the Attorney General is successful in getting the 11th to impose a stay. But there's lots of reasons to think that that might not be the case, and there are other places in the country where that hasn't happened. And I do want to just let you know who was stage whispering to me. That was Liz Schwartz, who's part of the legal team, on the marriage lawsuit. And I also saw Daniel Tilley back there, who is with ACLU and leading the charge on the federal case. And if you get a chance to read all of that, there's poetry in it, and it's really exciting. But yes, we could have marriage equality in Florida as soon as January 5th. And then we don't know what some of the local judges may do in terms of stays. I will say this, it's been an interesting time because not only has there not been the backlash, right, but the support that we hear. I mean, I was meeting with David Jolly, Republican congressman. His big issue is he wants to make sure that gay service members and veterans' spouses are treated equally, and that's one of the issues that he wants to carry as a flagship issue. And his message was, there's a Liberty Caucus in Washington that we really need to challenge to live up to the liberty principles that they espouse. And so I think that the game has changed. There's no assumptions that we ought to be making. In Tallahassee, time and time again, we hear from people who were visible parts of the 2008 campaign to put discrimination in the Constitution, who are saying, you know what, I was wrong. And many of them will point to their kids as having been the ones to challenge them and say, as one guy said to me, he said, I got in fights with my kids almost every time they came home from college. They were in high school when this passed. And he said, finally, my son said to me, Dad, I'm not going to argue with you about this anymore, but you raised us to treat each other, to treat everybody as equals, to treat people the way we want to be treated, and I'm really disappointed that you're not living up to those values. And he said, I've never been more... So those are the moments that us just being out and visible, and even my Tea Party loving high school friends from Panama City, Florida, we will fight about health care and all these other issues, and then they'll say, tell your wife I said hi. Oh, is it Logan's birthday? So on the purely human level, things are shifting, and that's not nothing.
Thanks. Congressman, do you have any, Congresswoman, I apologize, do you have anything to add to that?
The thing I would add is that the progress that we've been able to make through the last number of years in rapid-fire succession is really a credit to the community's leadership in terms of education. Not just being out and existing, but the organizational leadership that has taken place, building relationships with members, and back to when we had the tension over inclusive or non-inclusive passage of ENDA, and the frustration over that. And Barney went to bat and said, listen, we got to try to pass something, and something is better than nothing. But the reason that he took that position, and I agreed as well after listening to him, was because we had done quite a bit of education, but not quite enough to make it inclusive. And to get there, we're going to get there, but we have to make sure that we're not complacent, because yes, we've made a lot of progress, but don't underestimate our opponents. I mean, Stacey, you're absolutely right. There is still a very significant, powerful, dug-in opposition that will do whatever they can to throw obstacles in our way. I have no faith in Pam Bondi. She will do every single thing that she can to throw obstacles in our way. And then the other thing, not that I know whether, and Paul, you can tell me whether we could end up in the Florida Supreme Court direction at some point, but there are 4 Florida Supreme Court justices that age out next year. And now that Rick Scott has been reelected, he appoints them all. And you can just imagine what that means for anything that we care about that might end up at the Florida Supreme Court. Because
but I will say this, though. I don't mean to interrupt you. My goodness, I just interrupted a congressman.
It's okay.
I was just going to say, but, you know, we've never existed. Equality Florida has been around since '97. I think for a couple of weeks we had Buddy McKay. But it's been Republican, 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 and those, I think the neat thing that the marriage fight has shown us is how many of the decisions have come from Democrats and Republicans alike. And I do think that is, there's a lot of people, I don't know Pam Bondi, I don't know her outside of a political context, but I do know that there are people very close to her applying a great deal of pressure now that the election is over. You know, we even saw Rick Scott go from being unable to answer the question about whether Arizona should veto that sweeping religious exemption law to, like, I don't know, 2 hours later issuing a statement saying if he were the governor of Arizona, he would have vetoed it. And here's a guy, you go, how do you hold these two thoughts where the discrimination you think she should stop is actually legal in your own state? But I do think that they're dealing with the shifting demographic where they see what's coming. In Florida, we had 4.5 million Democrats, 4 million Republicans, and 3.7 million no-party affiliates. The fastest growing political group in our state are people who don't line up with either Democrats or Republicans, and they get this issue on LGBT equality. They don't want any part of the Republican culture war, and it's a battle for the soul of those independents. And the good news is, overwhelmingly, they break in our favor on LGBT issues.
That having been said.
That's right.
That having been said, Paul, did you, any thoughts that you had on
Well,
that?
actually, let me just, if I can just add something here. I am generally a glass is half full person, and we should be thrilled with all the progress, and our educational process should continue, and we should recognize clearly that there are politicians who are coming to the realization, and we don't care why, that some of their political future depends on not being intolerant bigots any longer. But, well, just saying. But
Thank you for your clarity.
That's right.
yeah. Clarity's never been my problem.
Usually when their kid comes out to them.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we all have to be very clear that turnout from the communities that care about the future of the issues that matter to us is critical. Resources, no resources, we have to, the reason that we didn't have as much success last Tuesday for candidates that support our agenda is because we didn't turn out in a midterm election. And I talked to too many people in this community, in communities across the state, who were either frustrated or who didn't understand why it mattered. And I can tell you with my partisan hat on, that we're going to take a deep dive at the national party level, and we're going to make sure that in states like Florida we do it too, into why are we having success when we elect a president who supports an agenda that we all embrace, and then in a midterm election, we can't get the same people out who voted for that candidate for president to vote for supportive candidates to back up and implement that agenda.
Well, I think that the question has been answered, and it's incumbent on everybody here. You must follow Stacey's advice and take a date to the next election. It's got to happen now.
Yes,
All right.
please.
No, I'm not going to say that, Paul.
Or two.
You can tweet that later.
Yeah, it's a new task force program. Take a hook up to the pulse.
There you go. It's a whole new way of doing advocacy. So, Stacy, please update us on, we've had just a little bit of conversation about ENDA, and I know it's sort of a depressing subject, but if you would, update us on the task force's continued work around ENDA.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I think everyone here knows that there was a historic vote for ENDA in the Senate, and there were 10 Republicans who actually voted to support ENDA in that vote. And then there was June, there was a decision called Hobby Lobby at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court basically determined that private corporations could make a decision based on religious beliefs. And the decision in this instance happened to be not following the letter of the law with respect to the Affordable Care Act. So they could, based on their religious beliefs, decide not to afford their employees with contraceptive coverage. And so looking at that, looking at the landscape, looking at the writing on the wall, understanding that the version of ENDA that passed in the Senate contained a very, very overly broad religious exemption that we really swallowed a bitter pill in terms of accepting it to begin with, and did so only because it was the only way to get the support of some members of Congress and to make it bipartisan. And so what we ended up doing was looking at what the court decision was in Hobby Lobby and decided to withdraw support for ENDA and demand that there be a narrow religious exemption in that bill. And so fortunately, fast forward a little bit, Congressman Polis in the House introduced some language that was narrower religious exemption language, something that is definitely something that we can live with and would preserve the jobs of people who are actually not performing religious duties. They happen to work for religious organizations, but they are people who are trimming the roses in the garden or cleaning the hallways or doing something that has nothing to do with the exercise of religion. And so they should be able to keep their jobs. Those are valuable jobs. And in some instances, we're talking about huge religious entities. And so there is a discharge petition that is on the floor of the House, and Congresswoman is on the petition. I checked before I came here, before I met you. The discharge petition is a procedure that would basically, if there were 218 signatures, force it to come to the floor for a House vote. I am not optimistic about that happening, but still, every instance we can, urging there to be support for the discharge petition. But it still does not have any GOP signatures on it, and it's a very short window of time between now and the end of the session, so I don't think that's going to necessarily happen. And then, do you want me to keep going?
No. I really. It's a robust subject, and we're going to get into that. We're going to get into the religious.
This is my first one, so
No. You're doing fine. We're just trying to. We want to make sure we can hit all subjects. I'd love to hear your take on ENDA.
So. There's no way that the discharge petition is going to pass. It's a purely partisan procedural move that the opposite party would just never do. Even co-sponsors of legislation on the other side of the aisle, and the same among Democrats when we were in the majority, don't sign discharge petitions. The goal really needs to be to add co-sponsors to that version of the legislation. The problem we have right now with opponents, I won't be partisan, with opponents of the legislation, mostly all of whom happen to be people who are not affiliated with my party. But the problem is that the opponents can't seem to get past the idea that you shouldn't interfere with how a business owner makes decisions about their own business. Ridiculous and discriminatory and unacceptable, but that's the obstacle that we appear to have, and inclusive or not inclusive. So we need to win over more Republicans, essentially, and a few Democrats as well, that we need to help understand that this is another form of bigotry, another form of discrimination. And also remember, it's not just about with the narrowing on the religious exemption, helping people keep their jobs. It's about hiring too. I mean, we've got to make sure that these organizations and institutions can't discriminate and not hire people because of their suspected sexual orientation or their actual sexual orientation. So,
Is there anything that you think that you can specifically do?
well, I can continue to swing from the chandeliers on how important this is.
I'm ready to see that.
And I will. And I will.
Okay.
Education is critical. One-on-one education, we have to invite colleagues who, don't represent a community that can fill an auditorium like this one, like I do. Let's also, we also have to keep in mind, in this community, we have a huge population of out, LGBT community members. And in so many of my colleagues' districts, they have just as large a population that is not out, that aren't as comfortable being out. And more now than used to be, but their exposure and their interaction, or at least their awareness of of their own constituency, is less than in districts like mine. So we need to make sure that our organizational activity encourages in districts where there might not be as many out members of the community, that the ones that are really reach out and build those relationships in Congress.
Yeah, thank you. We've been talking a lot about the religious exemptions, just so you don't get a pass on any of this, because I can't wait to hear your thoughts on it. The Hobby Lobby case really has so many far-reaching effects for the LGBT community. I mean, Stacy talked about the Affordable Care Act, and I think that was huge. But as it relates to our community, there's so many ramifications. So there seems to be this aggressive expansion of special religious exemptions, which means fewer and fewer Americans are subject to it, but they also receive protection from it, right? So how will the religious exemption in this case inform and affect Lambda's work going forward?
Hold that question, because I want to say something about the employment stuff that we've been talking about, separate from the religious exemption. It's and that is, there's been a lot of talk, I hear this all the time, about all the progress on marriage and that we haven't been moving on other things. And I just want to remind people that we've actually made a lot of progress on employment over the last several years as well. And I think we're going to continue to, in smaller pieces, not through, and I don't have a lot of hope in something happening in Congress in the next 2 years, but whether it was the change in the military policy, the President's executive order for federal contractors, the EEOC taking the position that sexual orientation discrimination is sex discrimination and therefore covered, and this is something we'll be fighting in the courts for quite a while yet. But between the courts and the executive agencies, there's actually been a lot of progress, and significantly more people have employment protections today than did last year at this time, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, when we first did one of these forums. And it's just curious to me, because I've been a glass half empty person like my entire life, and because I had very low expectations about the election, now I'm positively cheerful compared to all the people around me. And so when I have to start pointing out, oh, it's not so bad, people, things are still moving forward, there's something wrong in the room. Paul knows me well, and he's shaking his head. It's an odd position for me to be in. So I also think in the wake of the election, since Tony will holler at me if I don't talk about the election enough, it's in the title of our event tonight, I think people are writing off the president sort of too much and too quickly. There's still a lot of power in the administration in these communities. And a lot of that power has been used to help us as a community throughout this administration, and I think that's going to continue. And I don't want to sound like, Pollyanna here. I realize that Congress is going to be an impediment to certain kinds of things, but the agencies have a lot of power, and a lot of policy work, once done, is hard to undo. And, I hope we have a good president after the next election, and I encourage you to take lots of people to vote next time, not just one, because it's critically important to the work that we do in the courts. It's critically important to the Supreme Court, and who sits on the federal bench. It's not just the Florida Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court. So there's a lot at stake at every single election. But unless sort of Attila the Hun comes in the next election, so much groundwork has been laid, so many good policies have been put into place that would be very difficult for people to just come in and undo. So I'm a little more hopeful about the future. And if I'm the hopeful one, as I said, I'm very frightened.
Well, I think it's good news if you're hopeful.
There you go. Have you ever seen it before?
No, I haven't actually. I'm really not sure how to react. So, Paul, did you have any thoughts on this
let
as
me just throw a couple thoughts in it. What we're talking about tonight shows, at least in the short run and in the recent times, what's really been important to progress is courts, federal courts, and the Supreme Court. And that is, I think, where we're going to be making progress and fighting a lot of these fights for the next few years. And so that leads to a number of important conclusions. But one of them, of course, is there's a presidential election. I hate to talk about the next election just a week after the last one, but if we don't win that election with somebody who will appoint pro-fairness, pro-gay nominees, and you know which party is most likely to do that, then the next president's going to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And maybe others who are voting our way. And if that happens, the wrong way, then you could forget it. And you think we're going to win a marriage fight, we probably will win a marriage fight before that election. But the next case is going to be about religious exemptions. It's going to be about what Kevin mentioned, which is very important, the idea that we can solve all these employment discrimination problems by recognizing what should have been recognized a long time ago, which is if you're fired from your job because of who your boyfriend or girlfriend is and the gender of that person, that's sex discrimination. And that is where the law is starting to move, but it'll only move there if the Supreme Court ultimately says that's right. And we can solve all these ENDA problems under existing law, and it would be a remarkable achievement. It's already gotten there for transgendered people, ironically, with all the fights about inclusive and exclusive. The transgender community has a great deal more employment discrimination protection under existing law than just sexual orientation discrimination victims. But courts are where it's happening, and there is reason to be optimistic because it may be that there's going to be a backlash among the American people and that we have a lot to fight, but federal judges of this country have gotten religion. I mean, there were 23 in a row district court decisions in the past 12 months mandating marriage equality in federal court under the federal Constitution. That's remarkable. It is,
and many of those judges were appointed by Republican presidents.
And they were sitting in Utah and Oklahoma and all kinds of places. I mean, it was really Texas. I mean, this has been it's a sea change in what the federal courts are doing. And so as long as the Supreme Court doesn't become the problem and continues to be the solution, we will continue to make progress. In any event, voting is not unrelated to the courts, but courts are the reason. One of the reasons you should make sure everybody votes in 2 years.
Everybody votes. And 2 years after that.
And forever.
Yeah.
Well, can I just add
Please,
to this?
yeah.
Because I think it's important also, though, the courts obviously, I mean, here in Florida, we've pinned our hopes a great deal on a series of lawsuits that are unfolding. But Florida is changing because of the work that is happening at the local level with city councils and county commissions, all across the state. From the time Equality Florida was born until now, now over half of our state has non-discrimination laws that include sexual orientation, and nearly half have laws that include sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. The vast majority of students now go to schools where bullying and discrimination laws include enumerated categories that include us. The state has changed dramatically, and as those policies have changed, that's where the farm team of who's running for state house and who runs for Congress, it makes it a whole lot harder for a legislator to say, well, we can't do that because NOM was just in my office and they said if you guys, if this passes, this list of crazy things is going to happen. When you can say, Senator, you live in a city that's had this on the books for 5 years, 8 years, however many years. And so the process of winning these victories in tiny little conservative cities and large metro areas has been that people don't rise to the bait of our opposition in the way that they once did. And so it's been a huge part of our strategy to build those victories, whether they're in the Panhandle, where I grew up, or in the center part of the state, that is, the swing part of Florida. And the other piece is we have reinforcements that we didn't have before. The strongest voices in Tallahassee pushing for a statewide non-discrimination law right now are the largest businesses in our state. They form the Florida Businesses for a Competitive Workforce, and they are front and center, not just lending their logo to the coalition, but having their lobbyists working side by side with us, pushing for a statewide non-discrimination law. And when you think about it, especially now as the chessboard changes, what does it mean for a major company like Tech Data that's headquartered here, or Wells Fargo that has a huge footprint, to have to not just say, where should we move talent where we need it, but now they have to send it through a lens that says, if I ask the best person who lives in Iowa to move to Jacksonville, what am I asking them to give up? How much harder those decisions are. And so it hasn't been a hard sell when we began reaching out to business. They were going, yeah, we're losing top talent. There are people that we can't ask to make those sacrifices for their families because of this patchwork quilt of laws. So that is a voice that's going to continue to grow. And I believe that they're, you know, when you look at the finance reports of who just helped to re-elect the folks who are in Tallahassee, you'll see some of those same names. So it's a moment where a lot of things are shifting, and we've got to be willing to play on a lot of different terrains. But we've got reinforcements like we never had before. So when I say that we're used to being organizing in this kind of atmosphere, it's really important to also say that we didn't just go backwards, because even though the election fell the way it did, we're finding when the bill gets introduced, the Florida Competitive Workforce Act gets introduced, it's going to be introduced by a Republican in the next session, a decision made well before the election even occurred, because it was important to show that it's time for both parties to work together in Florida to secure these rights.
Well, I'm encouraged. I hope you all are as well. But that doesn't mean we haven't created a lot of opportunity for trucks to be driven through with this Hobby Lobby decision. So I'd like to circle back to that, and I'd like to hear where our risk points are on this, Kevin.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One of the big risk points is when we are working legislatively, and there are a lot of scary state legislatures out there. One of the things that has been great about winning a lot of the marriage victories in the courts is that those are clean wins. Now, that doesn't mean that we might not see pushback in some of the legislatures somewhere along the line, but, you know, we haven't seen it yet. And so I don't want to make light of the risks of these religious exemptions, but I think there's been a lot more fear about them on our side than I've actually seen concrete work from the other side right now. Now, do they feel emboldened by the election, and are people going to come screaming out of the hills at us? Well, maybe. The next election's not that far away, and if we all bring lots of friends to the polls, then I think we can actually stall some of these worst-case scenarios long enough to perhaps shift the climate again. And in the meantime, we're still making progress. So, you know, even if some bad religious exemption stuff passes in some states, we have to remember that we're still further ahead than we were overall a year or two ago, or even, let's just say, in September.
No, I was going to say I'm much more encouraged than I was when I listened to you speak last year.
Yeah, I was depressed then.
Yeah, you were.
But now I'm the cheerful
But now
one.
you're a glass half full kind of guy, so this is great.
Come back next year.
Go ahead.
Who knows?
That said, the Hobby Lobby case is going to lead to a case about whether a corporate employer who doesn't believe in equality for LGBT citizens has a right to hire and fire people on the basis of sexual orientation. That is going to happen. The President's executive order requiring that all federal contractors not discriminate will give lots of opportunities for this to happen. In the absence of ENDA, there hasn't been opportunities, but now there is. And so I think that law will get back to the court, that issue will get back to the court, not about contraception this time, but about employment discrimination. I don't know how quickly, but when it does, I think it'll be a hard case. The Hobby Lobby case, Justice Alito's opinion sort of nicely finesses the question of whether or not there would be sufficient reason to require people not to discriminate based on sexual orientation. He talks about race, but he doesn't say that we would necessarily treat other groups and other kinds of employment discrimination the same way. So this is, again, a situation where the court will be very closely divided, and probably Justice Kennedy will decide it, and we're not sure which way it'll come out, frankly.
Yeah. Stacey, anything that the task force is doing specifically for education advocacy, any work around this?
Yeah, actually, I was just sitting here thinking about the coalition building opportunity that the case presented. I can keenly remember standing on the steps of the Supreme Court when oral arguments were being heard for Hobby Lobby. It was a snowy, cold day, and we were there right alongside the reproductive choice and justice organizations that were basically giving remarks and talking about the importance of this issue and the importance of reclaiming our bodily autonomy and all of those things that as LGBT people we're very keenly attuned to, the privacy issue, the issue of making sure that you get to decide when and how you are able to build your family, the issue of recognizing the recognition that there are some of us, this is a bisexual plug, some of us are bisexual and actually do need contraception, when we're having, anyway, you get it. So the larger point was that the task force is one of the organizations, along with several others, that stand shoulder to shoulder with reproductive justice organizations, because we recognize that we have a rich history. Our destinies are intertwined, and I think that the opportunity that will present itself in the future with respect to a case that happens on employment protections in the religious context, I think will be an opportunity for the coalitions that we've built to actually bear some fruit. And I don't mean that in a quid pro quo sort of way, but I just mean that when we are joined together and working on issues of racial justice, when we are joined, as in the case of what's happening in Ferguson, or when we are joined together and talking about some of the common issues around reproductive justice and non-discrimination, we actually build a bigger tent, and we do afford ourselves an opportunity to show up and use our combined strengths to get the big wins that we want.
Right. Congresswoman, some of this bad stuff is legislated. What can we do to support your work and other legislators to ensure that we don't have these kinds of discriminatory practices memorialized into law?
Well, I don't think we can educate and reach out and sit down one-on-one and request meetings, even with, who would have thought that Orrin Hatch would ultimately decide to vote for an inclusive ENDA? That is not, speaking of things we would not have predicted. But we don't know you just don't know through people's life experience, recent and distant, what they bring to decisions. And so continuing to reach out and making sure that we're not writing off. We have a whole new class on both sides of the aisle of members, many of whom probably came from lower offices in which maybe they had inclusive ordinances that they supported or that were adopted and they've lived under and were just fine. The other thing I think is especially because of the Hobby Lobby decision, reaching out to religious institutions and religious leadership, not just the ones that we know are already with us, but even the ones that aren't with us. We've got to, it seems almost impossible to imagine that we could win over Southern Baptists, but to the degree that we can that we can sit down and have conversations around what religion is really all about for so many, at least mainline religions, we need to try. And when you do that, when you do that in an organizational way, it backs up your allies in the legislative process. Because if we have you really lobbying and building support in the community, it makes it much easier when we start to put it out there. And when I'm working the floor and talking to colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'm not having the first conversation with them about it.
Right. Nadine, you talked a lot about your equality means business and what progress and strides have been made, at the community level.
Sure.
But you didn't talk a lot about housing.
About housing?
Housing protections.
Oh, well, actually, both the state law that we're pursuing, the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, it would actually add sexual orientation and gender identity to the state civil rights statute that includes housing, public accommodations, as well as employment. And that's been true at the local level primarily. There may be a few exceptions to that, but it definitely includes housing as well.
Perfect. Very good. Thank you. Paul, even when the Supreme Court speaks, oftentimes not everybody gets in line with compliance. So just like there was still residual racism after Loving versus Virginia, there's still a lot of homophobia, which I think will continue to exist after full marriage equality. Is there anything that you think that we can learn from what happened in the past that will inform how we should approach this in the future, assuming marriage equality across the country?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, first of all, that the opinion of the American people on that issue in particular is changing dramatically in our favor on a daily basis. And that has been true starting back when the first same-sex couple started getting married in Massachusetts. As people started to see these couples get married under the force of a court order, they got to see that the sky didn't fall. And so while there continues to be opposition, and I think there may be a small uptick if the court rules, just as there was a little bit of a public opinion backlash after Lawrence, actually, right. But it dissipated very quickly. This is an issue on which American people will get over it pretty quickly, as they have in all of these states. And so, I think the most important thing is to continue to fight for equality on that issue, and that the public opinion takes care of itself. Now, there are other issues. This whole idea of mixing religion into it and personal freedom and transforming religious people who are not traditionally on our side into the victims here is I think, where this is all going to go. And I think that we have to be very constructive about this. As the Congresswoman said, we have to be sensitive to and communicate with religious institutions and recognize that some religious exemptions are not only desirable, they're constitutionally required. You can't tell people who to let into their church or their religious club or their prayer meeting or their book club or a lot of other things. People have a perfect right, both under the First Amendment, to make these kinds of choices. And we ought to be supportive of that and just talk, I think, in a constructive way about how that line has to be drawn between what is the business world, where people can't discriminate, and the private world, where people in their associations can. Some religious or even non-religious association clubs of various sorts. And be supportive of religious freedom to the extent that makes sense, and just talk constructively about drawing that line in a way that doesn't overly victimize people who feel like they're being pushed into the corner by our progress. And that, I think, is an ongoing work that all of these organizations are already engaged in and will be engaged in more, as this idea that our progress hurts somebody else continues to grow.
Yeah, but I would just add to that has been true, I think, in every civil rights movement in this country. I mean, there were white racists who used religion in a big way in the earlier days of the civil rights movement. There were people who thought religion had a role, and it certainly plays a role in the choice movement, in the women's movement. So I think we shouldn't act like this religious stuff is new for gay people. This is the current phase of it, and we have seen it before, we have fought it before, varying degrees of success, and we're going to have to keep at it. And I think one of the things, when people talk about, like, well, when the Supreme Court decides marriage, there's this sense sometimes like, well, then it'll all be over and we can all go home and we're gonna have won. And I would just like to say, now I'll be back to my old self. As a civil rights lawyer for a very long time at this point, like, no civil rights movement in this country has ever been over. Race isn't over, sex isn't over, choice isn't over. Sexual orientation, gay stuff is not going to be over with a Supreme Court decision or a bill passed by Congress, in some Congress down the road when we can get it. And, all of those are good and important things, and they are important goals that we have to push for. And each time we get one of them, we have to continue to dedicate ourselves to the movement and the fight, because if we let up on that, then our opponents are going to come back. And then it doesn't matter if we won at the Supreme Court or if we won in Congress. And so I think we just have to be very careful about like having some end point where we say, oh, good, it's done. Glad I was around for that. And you know, that's a bad way to think. That's all I'll say.
Can I just add to that? The case in point is the 2008 election of President Obama and the 2010 midterm in which we lost 63 seats in the House of Representatives, the majority of governors, the majority of legislative chambers flipped from supporters of these issues to opponents because there was some complacency. There was box checking, like, okay, we elected a president who's supportive of our agenda and of so many things, and look how much progress we've made. And, you know, we just assumed that everybody would continue to vote the way they did in 2008. Then we reelected him in 2012, and now this election last Tuesday, essentially the same thing happened. I mean, even with recognition that there was a problem 4 years ago. I mean, let's use our county, for example. We improved our voter turnout from 4 years ago. We were at 40% in 2010. We went up to 44%. The statewide average was 50.5. So we didn't even hit the statewide average. So complacency and a lack of motivation, for lack of a better term, as far as getting to the polls to, again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but it is not only important to elect a president of the United States who appoints the Supreme Court in order to make sure that our agenda has a forum for implementation across all three branches of government. We have to vote all the time.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's no longer acceptable just to take a person to the poll. Everybody here has to take a busload of people, right? Is that what we're talking about? Stacey, you mentioned this future march next year that the National Organization for Marriage is planning on staging. What do you think that the task force is going to be doing that will help win the hearts and minds in the court of public opinion?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, well, everyone knows that we have changed our name, so we are very much on a big push to promote our tagline, which is Be You. And we view it as an empowerment mechanism. It's an opportunity for people who have felt unheard or people who have been looking to find themselves in the mirror of the movement and see a spot for themselves. And so, beginning with the revamped website and with the name and with the tagline and with our upcoming conference, the Creating Change Conference, which will be in Denver in 2015 in early February. It's really an opportunity for us to continue to support people and educate them and give them the tools that they need, the training that they need, the grassroots and the leadership training, particularly for those of us who are most deeply marginalized and disenfranchised. So people who reflect lower income bases, people who are transgender and subject to street harassment or violence, or in some instances horrifically murder. We have a new campaign which is Stop Trans Murder, and you can go to our website, thetaskforce.org, to find out more information about that. But that's really designed to make sure that while we're keeping the focus on non-discrimination protections and while we are championing and happy to have seen Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed, to see Matthew Shepard bill pass, to see, and James Byrd Act pass, to see a great vote on ENDA, still holding out for comprehensive immigration reform, but there's still actually bodily harm being done to too many members of our community, and that's just unacceptable in any context.
Congresswoman, America leads the world in almost everything that is measurable. And as I'm sure you're aware, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, was quoted extensively, had his essay published in Business Week, that he was not only happy to be gay, but he was proud to be gay. What do you think would it take for our Congress, our leadership in this country, to actually lead on this issue of LGBT rights and actually lead across the world and across this country?
Lead legislatively?
Lead legislatively, lead in public opinion, lead in any way. We have a great opportunity, in my opinion.
We do. But then you look at, and I'm, like I said, I'm usually the glasses half, we reverse roles. I'm usually the glasses half full person, but,
Well, the reason I bring this up too is because, Apple is such a dominant organization.
Right.
I mean, its products touch every area of the world, oftentimes in countries where homophobia is illegal. I mean, homosexuality is illegal. And so there has been no real negative effect.
well, except the
In terms of
statue that was taken down.
Well, that was in St. Petersburg, and that was by the people who erected it. So yes, that was
Right.
sort of like they made a statement. But other than that, the price of Apple stock continues to go up.
No, exactly.
They're doing business all over the world. So I think this was a great opportunity for a huge business leader to really make that kind of statement. And it's an American company.
It is. I continue to underscore that education and helping politicians to realize that this is not like touching a hot stove, that they aren't going to come back and get burned. Remember, there's a difference that I think we have to recognize when we're going through the process of education and hoping to make progress with elected officials. Self-preservation is something that is the most important thing to most politicians. Most politicians want to be able to get reelected. I mean, that's just, since we're being direct. And in many cases, it's great to be on the city council and support an ordinance that is supportive of equality. But most of those races are nonpartisan races. They're not having to take on party primaries in which they have to worry about their right flank in this case. So making sure that we're cognizant of educating candidates, educating elected officials on the importance of embracing equality and helping in their communities, making sure that they don't feel like they're going to get burned if they touch the stove. That's really important. I mean, because the biggest obstacle that I think we have with opponents of equality in Congress and in legislatures is that they'd worry about drawing primaries by going too far out on a limb. And having spent 12 years in the legislature, Nadine, again, not wanting to be glasses half empty, I just have, when you've been through the legislative process, I mean, there's what we all know to be how a bill becomes a law, and I'm glad that there's a Republican introducing it, and that's a really smart political move. But there's a difference between just make sure you don't get played, because wonderful, there's a Republican introducing it, but does it ever get a hearing in a committee? Does it ever make it to the pocket calendar when push comes to shove at the end in the last 2 weeks of the legislative session, when the rules chairman has one card in his pocket, in his breast coat pocket, that determines which bills go to the floor. And you've been through those battles before, time and again. So we have to make sure that we're going into these arenas and these battles with very open eyes, because I don't want us to lull ourselves into this false sense of security that, look, we've got these co-sponsors and we've got a Republican lead, and at the end of the day, they can procedurally cut our legs out from under us. Don't let them get away with it.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the name of my book, though. It's going to be Don't Get Played.
Of all the things I don't worry about is Nadine getting played. I do not worry about that at all, I gotta say.
One final question, just open to anyone on the panel who wants to take a stab at it. How do you think our government should be responding to human rights abuses, not only in our country but around the world? And I'm thinking specifically about conversion therapy in the United States and really how that impacts our youth.
Well, aggressively. I mean, I think we have to I sit on the Appropriations Committee on the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, and, in the United Nations Forum, in international forums, we have to make sure that we are including our outrage, and President Obama, I know, believes this, over discrimination, human rights abuses in Uganda and Russia and other places. one of the reasons that the president's taken some of those actions that he has related to Russia's really horrific treatment of the LGBT population there. But I mean,
well, as it relates to conversion therapy, we only have 2 states right now out of 50 that have any protections at all. I just wondered if anybody else had an opinion or wanted to weigh in on that.
Well, State Representative David Richardson is pursuing that here in Florida, and certainly that's going to be an uphill fight. But I do think when I leave here tomorrow, I fly to Dublin for the International Gay Lesbian Youth Organization. And no, I ain't youth, but 30 years ago, I helped to found the organization, and 30 years later, it's grown into this incredible thing. But what I remember most in those early days, when I was still was still a teenager, was that I remember a bunch of our guys got roughed up by American GIs in Berlin during one of our organizing conferences. And when they came back to us and told us what happened, I was thinking to myself, yeah, you got to be careful out there. That's what happens, You should have been a little more stealthy. And everybody else in the room was outraged, immediately started organizing. There was going to be a demonstration in the largest plaza in Berlin. And I realized at that moment, it's like, when did it become okay to me? When did my immediate reaction, when did I learn to blame the victim, to think that when bad things happen to us, it's because we didn't hide successfully? Where did this message come from? And I was there as an activist, and it was a real eye-opener. And so when we talk about things, whether it's this psychological and spiritual abuse that is these re-education programs, I think what we have to get in touch with collectively is what is the appropriate reaction in a world that has told many of us from the day we were born that we shouldn't exist, and if we do exist, we better hide, and if we don't hide successfully, the bad things that happen to us are our own fault. That's a lot of unpacking, but I think that if we were to approach this issue with the outrage that we ought to be able to summon when we think of young people being abused by people in authority, that our reaction would be very much more than it is right now. And that is the outrage that I think organizing at its best taps into, and then people will take actions in ways that will end it.
I would just comment that the conversion therapy is a part of the much broader problem, which is what kind of world do people who are coming out in their teens end up facing? And a lot of it is in their own families, the kind of reactions that people face. And even after we win all these legal battles, there's going to be a problem with people who are either abused through this kind of therapy things or very often simply just thrown out of their families. An incredibly high percentage of the youth homeless population, youth in detention, juvenile detention are LGBT because they find themselves living without the supports of supportive families and are unwilling to convert, so to speak, or simply are rejected. And so there's this great socioeconomic problem that develops from that, which we're going to be combating for generations, I think, as that problem continues.
Well, and the other thing that ties in with that, and it's something that we haven't touched on at all this evening, is the HIV epidemic. About 50,000 people a year seroconvert in the United States. The vast majority of them are gay or bisexual men, and a significant majority of them are young people. And so this all ties together. I mean, young people have a much higher risk of getting HIV than they have of getting put into conversion therapy. And it is something that, there's still this sort of split in some ways between the gay community and the HIV community, and that we're not doing enough about, in a big collective we, to keep young people safe. Because when kids get thrown out of their home or kicked out of school or whatever, one of the things that often ends up is survival sex as a way that people get by. And that puts people at great risk. And this is not a group of people that have great access to health care and health insurance, even in today's health insurance world. Yeah. So there's just an unending list of things that we just touched on a little bit of the LGBT community agenda tonight. And the stuff we talked about is all really important. Right. But don't anybody think that we covered it all, because there's just so much more.
Yeah, thank you. We'll let that be the last word, at least for the panel. I want to just let everybody know that each of our panelists here tonight is here at their own expense and on their own time. So a special thank you to each of you all. I'd like to make just a couple of closing remarks, which are actually my own, because I actually see the lack of LGBTQ acceptance as great and as insidious a problem as our lack of civil rights that are memorialized into law. So just this weekend, I was with my mother at a conference, a woman I love very much and have a great deal of respect for, but she still is not in a place of acceptance or approval of the fact that I am a lesbian. And I know that there are other people out here in our audience that come from southern states or Midwestern states where that is still happening in their family of origin as well. So in my mind, the right for full equality, while it is encouraging, is really not yet assured, and we must continue our public education, our advocacy work, our legislative work, our work in the courts, certainly. And I really encourage each of you to be out in all areas of your life. And I encourage you to continue to fund organizations that have been tireless in the work to get us to the point that we are here right now. And I'd like you also to consider having compassion in your hearts for those people who believe that their discrimination is justified. We will have full participation and full protections over time, and I really believe that on the right side of history, each of us and all people in this great country of ours will enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for coming tonight.
Incredible. It was definitely enough to keep me energized for a while to come. I thought it was really fantastic to bring the community together right after an election that was certainly disappointing, but what I thought was most inspiring about the forum was the way the panelists did have a lot of optimism. One of the running jokes was that glass half empty, glass half full, and I think that the resounding message was that the game didn't really change and that we still are in a very similar climate that we were 2 weeks ago, and as a community we've always been resilient and we've always kept fighting, and I really am excited for the future of the LGBT movement, and I think that it was exciting to see that the future is bright because we are going to keep fighting the battles and gaining the support we need.
Hi, my name is Jason Hughes, and tonight was an excellent panel. We really enjoyed hearing all the different panelists. I think Mona was an excellent moderator, and it's really important to our community that people show up and are counted and do come out literally and figuratively for events like this in your workplace and in your home and your church and stuff. So congratulations to Tony at Our Fund for doing an excellent job. We're thrilled to be invited, and an excellent event. Thank you.
I thought it was amazing. The turnout was great, more women than there have been in years past. The panelists were incredible. I love that Mona started with issues not around marriage. I'm litigating for marriage. I feel as strongly for marriage equality as anybody else. But the event started with and ended with a lot of the other issues that our community is facing. These religious exemptions, zero conversion at these crazy high rates among young men, employment protections. I thought that the event really ran the gamut and covered a lot of issues that the community really needs to be concerned with. Our fund did an amazing job putting this together every year. I think this is a real highlight for people like me who are activists working on the legal battles that our community faces. This is just a must-attend event, and it was the best, this one, really, beyond. Thank you.
That was great.
This is a terrific event. It grows in intensity every single year. It's really wonderful to get to hear perspectives from all over the country about what's happening here in Florida. And Florida is is a state that is we're moving so fast when it comes to equality, when it comes to shifting public opinion, and I think that a lot of our national partners are drawn here because they see this tremendous opportunity. So this is an event I really look forward to each year, and you can hear behind us a lot of people continuing the conversations that began on the stage. So thank you to our fund for continuing to create a forum where we can have real, honest exchanges about where we are and where we need to go and what we need to do to get there.
I didn't know what that meant. You're kind of like Paul Joneses.